Welcome to The Great Awakening. I'm your host, Josh Dawes. My guest today is Mark David Hall. He is a professor at Regent University and the author of many, many books on the American founding, which is where his area of expertise is. His most recent book is Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land, which talks about how Christianity informed and influenced many of the liberties that we consider essential here in America. And his book before that is Did America Have a Christian Founding? And that's the book that I wanted to have Dr. Hall on to talk about because several weeks ago I had Christopher Rufo on the program, and we, through the course of conversation, ended up talking a bit about Christian nationalism. And Chris casually mentioned that our founders intended for this to be a secular project, that America had a secular founding, that it was never intended to be a Christian nation. And I didn't have time to get too much into that because there were some other things I wanted to ask Chris in that interview. So I wanted to reach out to Dr. Hall to have him come on so we can really unpack that, whether or not this country was founded as a Christian nation. Did we have a Christian founding, or was it secular? What about the claim that, a lot of our founders were deists? Is that true? Is that where their ideas came from? Is this more of an Enlightenment project, or is this actually the founding of America actually rooted in Christianity? It's a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking with Dr. Hall. He is obviously an expert on the subject matter. When it gets to kind of our takes on modern, the current situation where we're at, we kind of see things a little differently. And so we get into a little bit of, I think healthy disagreement toward the end of the show. But I think it hopefully models a way that Christians who maybe disagree on how to read the times can talk to each other and have a fruitful conversation. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. So let's jump right into my conversation with Mark David Hall. Thanks for joining me, Mark.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So this is a conversation I've been wanting to have for a while. I think, the founding is such an interesting, it's such an important time period. And I think a lot of us have some faulty understandings of it that have, kind of built up over the last, 50 or 60 years as, the idea of separation of church and state has become really kind of implanted in kind of the national narrative. So I wanted to have you on to kind of talk about the founding and what was the nature of that. Recently had Chris Rufo on, and we were discussing Christian nationalism and whether or not that's a helpful term or a helpful movement. And his big objection to that was that the idea that America was ever a Christian nation kind of flies in the face. It contradicts everything that the founders were trying to do, that this was a secular project, that many of the founders were deists themselves and were more influenced by the Enlightenment than they were Christianity. And so didn't have a ton of time to get into that with him. His time was running short, but I wanted to have you on to kind of address that. Like, is that a good way to think about the founding?
Yeah, so I think it's an understandable way to think about the founding. In my book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? As you know, each chapter I begin with something like 16 quotations of people saying most of America's founders were deists, or most of the founders were Enlightenment rationalists. And some of these books are written by polemical authors, but some are written by good, solid academics at respectable places. And so someone like Chris could read 5, 6, 7 books and come away with the idea that there's a consensus that the founders were deists, Enlightenment deists, and that sort of thing. But what I attempt to do in each of my chapters is demolish the myth. And by myth here, I mean a false story. So let me begin with most of America's founders were deists. It's not an uncommon claim, but when you look at how this claim is supported, it's always supported just by going to 5 or 6 individuals, very prominent individuals to be sure. The 4 men who became president of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, usually Ben Franklin, often Alexander Hamilton. And when you look at these men, you do see a higher percentage of these individuals who are not Orthodox Christians. We know for sure that Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams were not Orthodox Christians. The case with the others is far weaker, though, far weaker. And that's one of the points I make within the book. But then I also push on a bit to say, what do we mean by deist? And what most people mean by deist is a clockmaker God, right? A God who does create the world. Maybe he cares something about morality. Maybe there's an afterlife, but certainly he doesn't engage in the affairs of men and nations. He doesn't do miracles. He doesn't, do things like have virgins, have babies, and that sort of thing. And so if this is what we mean by deism, then I think it's fair to say none of the founders were deists, with the possible exception of Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine, if we count him as an American. And he, of course, is from England and spends most of his life in Europe. And so what do I mean by this? Well, George Washington, for instance, is always talking about God intervening in the affairs of men and nations in personal ways, in national ways, in private letters, in public speeches. And actually, all of these founders routinely talk about God intervening in the affairs of men and nations. So even these prominent founders are not deist. Again, at least three of them are not Orthodox Christians. But if we can turn our eyes away from these very prominent founders and look at the rest of the constellation of founders, and I'm not talking about peasants in the field, I'm talking about important founders, a John Jay, a Patrick Henry, a Roger Sherman, a James Wilson, evidence of deism or heterodoxy just disappears. And so I think it's a profoundly faulty claim. It's a claim that focuses on a very unrepresentative sample. How unrepresentative? Ben Franklin spent half of the last 35 years of his life in Europe. Jefferson and Adams spent significant time in Europe. Almost no one was more influenced by the Enlightenment than Thomas Jefferson was. And so I think we have to be real careful generalizing from this very small select group of founders, all of whom, by the way, by the end of their lives were Anglicans, at an era when only about 15% of Americans were Anglican. John Adams is the exception. Whereas 50 to 75% of Americans are reasonably classified as Calvinist. And these Americans are almost completely unrepresented in this small little sample. John Adams be the only one who is a lifelong Congregationalist, but as I've already conceded, a very bad Congregationalist, not an Orthodox Christian. So again, I think the argument that most or many of America's founders were deists just absolutely falls apart upon closer scrutiny.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that those are the ones that are kind of held up as representative of the founders, and we don't look to guys like John Jay, who I believe started the American Bible Society?
He was intimately involved in an early president, to be sure.
Yeah.
They're obviously important men, and they should be studied. One of the things I did early in my career is I helped edited 3 different books profiling something like 33 of America's founders, or religious views, or views of church-state relations. And of course, I included all of these important individuals. You can't ignore George Washington, obviously. My argument has never been to ignore them. It's been to expand the conversation to look at people like John Jay, Patrick Henry, Roger Sherman, James Wilson, and others, and then to be careful not to generalize from this small, unrepresentative population. If you were to look real carefully at a Clarence Thomas, a Michael Steele, a J.C. Watts, you could properly conclude that these African Americans are conservative in a variety of ways. And if you were writing biographies of them, you would want to represent that. But to say most African Americans today are conservative because look at my little sample, that's obviously very bad, very bad social science. And if we were doing history, it would be bad history.
Yeah. So, okay. So if, someone may agree with that and say, okay, yeah, you've got a point there. But just because the other founders were Christian doesn't necessarily mean that, their ideas were derived from Christianity. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the very first thing I do in my book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? Is I say, what do we mean by a Christian founding? And I lay out a couple of different options. One option is most or all of America's founders identified themselves as Christians. Well, if this is what we mean, then obviously we had a Christian founding. 98% of Americans of European descent are Protestant. The other 2% are Roman Catholic. And you have about 2,000 Jews in a handful of cities. But I go on to say that would be an uninteresting finding. How do we know they were Orthodox Christians or sincere Christians or Christians who wanted to create a secular constitutional order. So that was a very uninteresting finding. I move on to the question, the possibility that they were all Orthodox Christians, and I concede that we cannot prove this. We simply do not have the papers, the private manuscripts of diaries, letters, that can show that most of America's founders were Orthodox Christians. I think you can make a very, very strong case in some instances, John Jay, Roger Sherman, and others. But in other instances, we have almost no papers. And so I don't make that claim. I consider a couple of other possibilities, but let me go on to where I land. And I say, we can say America had a Christian founding if America's founders were influenced by Christian ideas or ideas developed within the Christian tradition of political reflection. And let me give you a few examples. The founders to a person were convinced that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And even Christians continue to struggle with the old man within. Now, you could say, wait a minute, Hall, that's not a uniquely Christian idea. You could be a Chinese peasant in the 8th century and come to this conclusion. And that certainly is the case. They might not call it sin. They might call it the Chinese equivalent or self-interest. You could come to this just by living in the world. However, again, in an era where 98% of Americans are Protestant, 2% Roman Catholic, they're reading the Bible, many are Calvinists, talking about the total depravity of human nature. They're learning to read with the New England Primer that has a cute little alphabet rhyme that begins A, Adam. In Adam's sin, we all fall. I think the most logical argument is that, in fact, America's founders were convinced that humans were flawed, selfish, self-interested for Christian reasons. And accordingly, they designed a constitutional order characterized by checks and balances, separation of powers, and that sort of thing. Enlightenment political thought at the time was going in the opposite direction. Enlightenment thinkers wanted a strong central government run by the experts. Why trust the hoi polloi out there, right? The regular people. America's founders would have nothing to do with that. So that's just one of the ways in which I think you can make a very good argument that America's founders were influenced by Christian ideas, and this impacted very directly their experiments in self-government at the state level, as well as especially the new national constitution.
Can you talk? I'm reading your latest book. Help me with the title again.
Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land.
Yeah, the first chapter on the Puritans and kind of their take on liberty, and you just smell a lot of myths there as well. Can you talk about how they're, that kind of first group of pilgrims over to the new land, the colonies, how their political philosophy kind of informed the founders?
Absolutely. Let me answer a slightly different question, then I'll get to the question you asked. If you go back to the Protestant Reformation, think about some of the key battle cries of the Protestant reformers. Sola Scriptura, Scripture alone. This will be our primary guide to faith and practice. Priesthood of all believers. Well, we're still going to have ministers, but everyone is responsible for reading the Bible and interpreting the Bible for himself, and many eventually said herself as well. Well, when you put these two things together, what do you have to have if everyone's going to be reading the Bible? You have to have widespread literacy. And so you have an explosion of literacy in Protestant countries, especially Reformed countries. You have almost universal male literacy among the Pilgrims and then the Puritans who followed them. As well, this is a profoundly leveling doctrine, right? We aren't going to have the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church where people are looking to Rome for guidance and that sort of thing. We're going to have these individuals reading the Bible, interpreting the Bible for themselves. This translates pretty naturally, I think, into congregational forms of government. So we have a congregation of Christians, local church. The minister dies. What do? We come together and we discuss, okay, who should be the next minister? We debate among ourselves. Eventually, we take a vote. That sounds a lot like democracy, right? And in fact, this is what you have all throughout New England at both the ecclesiastical level with respect to church government, but also with respect to town government. You have close, upwards of 75% of males could become freemen. They could vote. It could actually be higher if you have any gumption within you. So you have Republican institutions like the world had never seen. Now, with that said, we have to understand that 17th century Puritans are products of the 17th century. They're not 21st century liberal Democrats. In the 17th century, everyone, Protestant, Catholic, everyone, all stripes of Protestant, just took it for granted that civic authorities would protect and promote their understanding of true Christianity and would, in general, promote vice and punish virtue. So everyone is doing this. The Puritans, however, I think it's fair to say, were among the most tolerant of all the various European civilizations you could look at. I say civilizations because they're kind of part of Great Britain, but pretty independent and autonomous and that sort of thing. And so the Puritans understood that there should be no compulsion in terms of religion. And so if you were a dissenter, but you just kind of kept your head down and were quiet, generally you would be tolerated. Now, it's true that there were some groups that were seen as being beyond the pale. Catholics, particularly, right? Because they're reporting to Rome and they have designs on enslaving the world. And so, yeah, we aren't going to tolerate them at all. But guess what? Protestants aren't tolerated in Catholic countries either. They're not tolerated in England. So really, toleration is the best you can hope for. And it's not that robust anywhere. Quakers as well were seen as profoundly disruptive to the public order. And so they were banned. But otherwise, Protestant dissenters were tolerated. There's an understanding that there should be a rule of law. You have the Massachusetts Body of Liberties contains many of the rights that eventually made its way into the Bill of Rights. Just simply having the rule of law is a very important protection. In general, though, and this is something that our 21st century Americans have a hard time getting our minds around, really well into the 19th century, almost everyone, and certainly all of America's founders, and certainly the Puritans, thought that civic liberty basically meant the ability to do what is right. So to say the Puritan authorities, I have a right to publish pornography or to engage in blasphemy, they would say, absolutely not, right? You don't have a right to do something wrong like that. And guess what? Most of the founding generation would have said the same thing. It's not till that we get to the 19th century with John Stuart Mill, and really his ideas don't make their way into American law until the late 19th, early 20th century. James Wilson, one of my favorite founders, had a great little epigraph of his law lectures. Law without liberty is tyranny, but liberty without law is licentiousness. And by law here, he means moral law. You don't have a right to do wrong. And so the Puritans, just like the founders, embrace this understanding of liberty. Again, this doesn't seem sufficient to our modern ears, but we need to understand the historical context if we want to fairly evaluate them. And so they did believe in liberty, but not a 21st century or even 20th century understanding of civil liberty. But again, nobody did. And that's not a defense to them, right? Everyone was doing bad, so it's okay they did bad. But I think just to evaluate them fairly, we need to understand they were better than almost anywhere else you could find in the European world.
Mm-hmm. How much of our founding ideas, one of the criticisms is if they had meant for it to be a Christian founding, why don't we see that in our Constitution? How much of their thinking was kind of based on maybe like a common law tradition where a lot of it was just assumed that there's a Christian moral framework that we're building upon?
Sure. Well, let me again take a slight step back and say I have spent my entire academic career trying to get Christianity on the table. So there's book after book after book written about how America's founders were Enlightenment liberals, a very secular form of Lockean liberalism. And if not that, the classical Republican tradition. If not that, the common law tradition. If not that, the Scottish School of Moral Sense. And so in 10 or so academic books with university presses, I've pushed back and say, no, wait a minute, guys. Christianity is a very important influence that ought to be taken seriously. But it's not the only influence, to be sure. Why do we have 12 persons on a jury? That's a common law tradition, right? I know you have 12 disciples and 12 tribes, but that's not why we have 12 persons on a jury. And so I am open to the reality that we need to look at a variety of influences. When America's founders were designing constitutional regimes, they looked to Montesquieu and some of his sites with respect to separation of power. So we need to recognize that. But I think Christianity is a very important aspect of the founding and one that deserves to be taken seriously. Now, one thing that's critically important to understand the founders is when they created the federal Constitution, they understood this document as creating a national government that would do only a very few things. Those things articulated in Article 1, Section 8. Everything else government should be doing would be done by the state or local governments. And so, especially when it comes to the promotion of religion and morality, these would be done by the state or local governments. And so, states are free to retain established churches if they desire. They're free to remove the established churches. And as you know, I have a chapter on this, and I argue that the reason states disestablish churches, a primary reason, is because they hurt true Christianity. They corrupt Christianity. And so therefore, if you care about having a Christian commonwealth at the state level, at the local level, you want to get rid of establishments. But that doesn't mean you can't have chaplains. It doesn't mean governors can't issue calls for prayer and fasting and so forth. There's a variety of things government can do to promote Christianity. And in that era, it would have been Christianity per se. Today, of course, presidents and governors still issue calls for prayer and fasting, but they frame them very broadly so that they're acceptable to people from multiple religious traditions. And I think that's appropriate in the very pluralistic country we live in today. But the founders, again, they would have said it's up to states and localities to promote Christianity or morality to the extent they're going to promote it. And maybe they shouldn't even be doing that. Maybe we should just leave the inculcation of Christianity and virtue to churches and families and voluntary societies. And I'm kind of sympathetic with those conclusions. I think when government gets involved in running things, it oftentimes hurts the very things it's trying to help. So let's get the government out of that business. And so I would make a distinction. I don't think America's founders thought they were creating a Christian nation. When I say America had a Christian founding, I mean to say they were influenced by Christian ideas when they developed the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and in many cases, state constitutions and laws. And they understood, for instance, I argue, I have a whole chapter arguing that they drew from the Christian traditions to the tradition to embrace a view of religious liberty for all, for Protestants, for Catholics, for Jews, and for those Americans of other faiths that would come later. And we see this in a variety of provisions, right? We don't even have to get to the First Amendment. The Constitution itself bans religious tests for office. The Anti-Federalists said, oh my goodness, this means a Jew or a Muslim or even an atheist could hold office. And the Federalists had to say, yeah, that's right. They usually went on to say, but that will never happen. Don't worry about it. So I'm not saying they thought those things would be good outcomes, but they did recognize, I think, that religious liberty applies to all. Multiple times in the book, I quote George Washington's fantastic letter to the Hebrew synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, where he makes it crystal clear that this tiny handful of Jews has the same right to religious liberty as Protestants and Catholics.
Yeah. You mentioned the state constitutions. My friend Timon Klein has written several times just about the things in those constitutions that would surprise most of us. Actual established churches in some of them, religious tests, things like blasphemy laws and stuff. Why you touched on it a little bit, but why did the states begin to kind of roll that stuff back? And do you think that there's any correlation to like the mess we kind of see ourselves in today, that we've kind of went too far in the in kind of like removing Christianity explicitly from our laws?
Yeah, so to this day, every state constitution clearly references a deity. And in the context in which they were written, it's only reasonable to think this is a Christian God, even if it's just a generic reference to God or creator or something like that. And you're exactly right. Some states, usually they would provide mechanisms for funding churches, even in Massachusetts, right, which remains kind of a quasi-Puritan republic, not technically Puritan. The funding mechanism basically permitted localities to tax everyone to support a favored church. Now, that usually was a Congregationalist church, but it didn't have to be. It could be a church of the Baptist or the Episcopalians or so forth. And eventually, one of the reasons Massachusetts got out of that business altogether is in the 19th century, you do have the growth of Unitarian churches. And the Unitarian churches took advantage of this provision to tax everyone to support the Unitarian church. And all of a sudden now the conservative Christians say, wait a minute, we don't like this. Let's get the state out of the business altogether. You're exactly right about religious tests for office. In 1787, 10 of the 13 states had religious tests for office, oftentimes requiring office holders to be Protestant, sometimes just Christians. That's 1787. 2 years later, New York actually adopts a new religious test to keep Catholics from holding office. And so this is an issue that's being contested in the era. Should we have religious tests? The federal constitution went one way, most states went the other way. I am inclined to say religious tests are a bad idea. So I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I will share my faith with anyone who will listen. But if it comes down to an election and I have a chance to vote for a pro-life, fiscally conservative Jewish candidate or a pro-choice, irresponsible Protestant candidate, I would vote for the Jewish candidate any second, in a heartbeat, right? And so I think a religious test that would keep that Jewish candidate from running is simply a bad idea. And the founders, in talking about religious tests, one of the arguments was they don't do any good. If you have an infidel, he will simply lie, right? Because why would an infidel not lie? He'll say, sure, I'm a Christian. And so they don't do any good and they might do harm. So let's get rid of them. So the federal constitution got rid of them. States eventually got rid of them. Most states eventually, in like 1961, some states still had them. And the U.S. Supreme Court finally got around to saying they're unconstitutional. But as late as 1961, they were still there. North Carolina still has a religious test for office, but it's been unenforceable since the Supreme Court decision. A little bit more interesting. So I don't like religious tests for office. I think they're a bad idea. I don't like established churches. Literally, sometimes in these established churches, you have the government telling the church how it's going to govern itself. Now, in my mind, that's a recipe for disaster. You have a government telling ministers how often they'll preach and administer the sacraments. I just don't want the government involved in that. If you turn to morals legislation, there I become a lot more sympathetic. Every state was involved in rewarding virtue and punishing vice. Now, some of the decisions they made, we can argue with, right? Pennsylvania in the late 18th century was still banning plays. Well, I'm not sure that's the best use of government resources or even a good thing, right? On the other hand, to say we're going to have laws severely restricting the production of pornography, certainly distribution of pornography, and certainly laws that prohibit pornography in schools, public schools, for goodness sake. Yeah, I think there's a lot of merit behind those sorts of things. And it's very reasonable for us to advocate for them. And I'll hasten to say, I don't think this is a distinctively Christian issue. I was recently talking with an Islamic attorney friend of mine who is battling this battle right now in Montgomery County. And she and I have the exact same position. Look, we don't want censorship, but we also don't want pornography in elementary schools. That's just wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with the idea of separation of church and state, how did that develop? Because clearly, looking back, that was not what we imagine it today, back during the founding era. And for, it seems like, a century after. How did the current understanding of separation in church and state, how did that develop?
So I've come to hate that phrase, and I suggest none of us use it. You could argue the separation of church and state goes back to Jesus Christ, given to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Pope Gelasius, the two swords doctrine. I think Orthodox Christians have always held that the church and state are separate institutions. They ought not to be the same. The state ought not to be the church. Church ought not to be a state. All right, fine. What does this mean in the American context? Well, the Pilgrims and the Puritans recognized church and state were separate institutions. And in fact, they banned things we wouldn't even think of banning today. For instance, Massachusetts for a while said a member of the clergy cannot hold civic office, right? He just simply can't hold it. So that's a form of separation of church and state, but it's not one that I think is particularly healthy or useful. But the Puritans were clear. The two can work together to promote Christianity, to promote virtue, to punish vice. Well, by the time we get to the American founding, I've already suggested that this is still going on at the state level. At the federal level, however, the Federalists were insistent, and I think they were sincere about this. Alexander Hamilton might have wanted something different in his heart of hearts, but the Federalists ended up saying, look, we have a constitution with strictly enumerated federal powers. The Congress can only do certain things, and it certainly doesn't have the power to establish a church. It doesn't have the power to ban the Baptist faith. It's severely restricted with respect to religious liberty, church-state relations. The anti-federalists were not convinced, and so they advocated for a Bill of Rights. One was eventually adopted. And here's where I would say, instead of talking about the separation of church and state, let's talk first anyway, and that's this context about the First Amendment And of course, we have provisions at the state level we might discuss. But let's start with the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So consider just the words of what we call the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That is not a two-way barrier. That in no way keeps a church from attempting to influence the state. It's a limitation on Congress. Congress shall make no law. Doing what? Advancing religion in any way, shape, or form? No. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. I think those words mean exactly what they say. Congress cannot create an established church. We are not going to have a church of the United States of America. And I think that's a great idea. I'm perfectly happy with that. By extension, through the 14th Amendment, now the states cannot create an established church. So Arkansas, Alabama, New York cannot create official state churches. I'm fine with that outcome. However, that leaves a lot of room for governments to do things to promote even specifically Christianity or religion more specifically. Governors and presidents issuing calls for prayer and thanksgiving, states adopting programs whereby parents can use vouchers to send their children to religious schools. Maryland doesn't have to tear down a 25-foot concrete cross memorializing dead men from the county from World War I. And so this idea, the separationists, Americans United and others would say that the First Amendment prohibits all those things I just mentioned. I think they don't at all. I think what it prohibits is very limited, and there's a lot of flexibility. Now, we can argue and debate what should states do. I think it actually would be constitutionally permissible for a state to adopt a voucher program that only funded parents of Christians to send their kids to Christian schools. But I think that would be highly imprudential in the pluralistic society we live in today. And so I would say any decent voucher program would say to any parent, look, we will permit you to send your child to the school of your choice, be that a Jewish yeshiva, an Islamic school, a Protestant school, a Catholic school, an atheist school. Let's treat people equally. And in fact, I think you can make very good Christian arguments in favor of that sort of equal treatment.
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of the discussion around Christian nationalism, whether or not that's a good term or not, I go back and forth on it myself. It really comes down, in my reading of it, to whether or not Christians believe that we should govern according to a Christian moral framework. Do you think that that's appropriate? It just seems to me that there's always going to be some moral framework, and it might as well be a Christian one.
Yeah, so let me tell you, my next book is on American Christian nationalism on these debates, and I've written, you can Google my name and Christian nationalism, and you'll come up with 8 pieces or so. So what I point out is prior to 2006, almost no one is saying, I'm a Christian nationalist. Christian nationalism is a good thing. Starting in 2006, about every other year, you have a book coming out warning of this horrible specter of Christian nationalism, Christian theocrats who want to take over America for Christ and oppress everyone except for white Christian males. So oppress women, oppress racial minorities, certainly religious minorities. It's a horrible, scary thing, guys. Really, it's only critics who are talking about this until just last year, 2022, where Marjorie Taylor Greene comes out and says, oh, I'm a Christian nationalist, and it's a good thing. To this day, she's the only elected member of Congress to identify herself as such. And then, of course, you have Torben Iskor and Stephen Wolfe coming out and saying, oh, Christian nationalism is a fine thing. Doug Wilson a little bit. So this is a very recent phenomenon where anyone is saying Christian nationalism is a good thing. And of course, they attempt to redefine it. They say we aren't talking about this scary, racist, sexist specter, although sometimes they make hints that suggest maybe they embrace some of that. And so I think it's just highly imprudent. So I would say it's just dumb for Christians, and no offense if you've ever done this. I think it's dumb for Christians to even toy around with it, embracing the label. Instead, we should say, look, we're Christians, and we have an obligation to be salt and light in the city. We have an obligation to engage in political activity, and we may certainly be guided by our Christian convictions. And so a great instance of this, and I give a number of instances in my recent book, the abolitionist movement, Christians engaging in the public square to end the scourge of slavery in America, making explicitly Christian arguments, drawing from Christian convictions and being motivated by their Christian faith. You can push up to the American Civil Rights Movement. Almost all the leaders were reverends. and drawing from the Christian convictions and fighting to end Jim Crow legislation. The pro-life movement over the last 50 years, largely powered by people of faith who say, look, an unborn child is a human being and it deserves to be protected. And we can make Christian arguments to that end. But guess what? We can also make excellent arguments based on shared moral convictions and science to that end as well. So absolutely, Christians should be engaged in a public square. We can draw from our Christian convictions. I think given the pluralistic environment in which we live, it's oftentimes, if we're talking to our fellow Christians, we can maybe quote the Bible and say we ought to oppose abortion for these reasons. But if we're a candidate running for office in a district like the one I live in Oregon, I'm probably going to stick to more broad arguments that could be accepted by liberal Protestants and conservative Protestants and atheists and Jews and Hispanic Catholics. Not that, any number of those people might be influenced by biblical arguments, but you get what I'm saying, right? You try to make arguments that are working in the public square.
Yeah. I think my hang up with that, and I get all of the arguments why it's a bad idea to use the label. I really do. And I think my hang up though is that the moment you say I'm a Christian and I think we should ban drag shows for kids, or we should ban gender affirming surgeries, you're going to be labeled a Christian nationalist. And I don't know what to do with that. And I see a lot of Christians that are running away from any sort of political activity because they're scared of that label. And I worry that if Christians if we get sidetracked by warning, about this label, we're basically creating an empty bucket that the left is going to fill with whatever ideas, Christian, ideas that they don't like. And suddenly that's a Christian nationalist.
I think it's a fair point. And the more responsible people that sort of embrace the label, someone like an Al Mohler or a Doug Wilson, if you look, they're pretty careful. They say, look, this is not a label I would have chosen, but I won't run from the label if by this label we mean A, B, and C. And it's definitely not this sexist, racist, scary hodgepodge described by all the critics. What I've done, my approach has been, I've been critical of Christian nationalism. I've been critical of the critics of Christian nationalism. I've explained why I don't think we should embrace the label of Christian nationalist. I've been called a Christian nationalist, so you're exactly right about that. But I say, look, I'm not a Christian nationalist. I've criticized the idea, and I've said we shouldn't accept it. So why don't we get away from labels, and let's just talk about the issue of abortion. I believe abortion should be severely restricted for these reasons. And in some contexts, I want to even mention the Bible, right? I make good natural law arguments of the sort made by Robbie George or Ryan Anderson. And, just kind of lay out these arguments and say, okay, you explain to me where I'm wrong about the moral principle. Innocent human life ought to be protected, or the scientific arguments I've just made for why we should understand a fetus to be a human being. And this, I think, there's still going to be the critics that won't listen to us, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess our target audience are those Americans in the middle, where I think if we make good arguments against drag queen story hours, the conservatives are automatically on our side. But there's a lot of Americans in the middle, maybe even left of center, who say, what in the heck is going on? We just want the public library to host, stories, by people not dressed up in drag, and to loan out books and maybe videos. Yeah. So that's kind of my hope. But the critics will always say, use a label as long as it's useful. They've already moved on, some of them. Now it's Christo-fascist, right? Yeah. So Christian nationalism wasn't scary enough. So Christo-fascist, probably Nazis are next. You can't control that.
Yeah. And that's been my encouragement to pastors that have kind of been warning about Christian nationalism. Like, please explain exactly what you mean. Because the media is going to use that term to describe you. And so if you're warning people, if you're just using that label without explaining exactly what you mean by that label, then you're going to drive a lot of good Christians away from, the political realm altogether. And we definitely don't need that right now. The founders, didn't envision the world, that we're living in. John Adams famously said that, our Constitution was only for a moral and religious people. is it still sufficient for us now? Are we? Is there is there hope? Are we too far gone as a people to be governed in the way that we have been?
That's a great question. James Hudson of the Library of Congress described what he called the founder's syllogism, which is that if you're going to have a Republican form of government, you must have a moral people. If you're going to have a moral people, you must have a religious people. And in the founding context, they definitely meant Christianity. They didn't mean just any religion. And the idea is that Christianity helps generate the moral norms necessary for democracy, for treating your opponents with respect, telling the truth, accepting defeats, and that sort of thing. And so I think the founders would be pretty worried if they would look at the demographics today. What about 65% of Americans identify themselves as Christians, but many of those never darken the door of a church. Obviously, our politics, politics has always been messy. The election of 1800 was a very ugly election. But boy, things do seem vicious and polarized today in ways that, if not entirely unprecedented, are still pretty doggone scary. And so they might say, yeah, this is problematic. And one of the reasons is because people don't have this moral framework to restrain themselves. And so they engage in vicious attacks and lies and that sort of thing. And so they would be worried. And so as a Christian, I pray for revival. I pray that Americans would turn back to Christ, would become Christians. And I think this would be very salutary for America. On the other hand, I don't lose complete hope. And if the demographic profilers are right and we continue down this path, fortunately, the founders left us with some important ideas: the rule of law, a federal government that should be more limited than it is, certainly separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism especially, right? So as bad as things get in places like Washington, Oregon, and California, we have places like Florida and Tennessee and Alabama, right? And so there's maybe more hope for these localities for more sanity with respect to drag queen story hours and that sort of thing. I think you can look as well to countries like Japan and Taiwan. I would have said until last year, maybe Israel, countries obviously not populated by Christians, but that have pretty solid, functioning, stable democracies. And so maybe the founders were wrong. Maybe you don't have to have a Christian people in order to have a moral people, in order to have a Republican form of government. But I do think it is there is cause for concern, and yet not to be hopeless. And so I think as just to kind of focus on Christians on the right, I think one of the things we could do is to help tap down this kind of scary rhetoric of the Christian nationalists. People like Tober and Iskor and Wolf, they do say things that kind of seem scary, right? The family is a fundamental unit of society. The husband is the head of the family, so therefore only married men should vote. Well, that's just really, really off-putting to a lot of Americans, including people who are already on the right, but certainly if you're in the center or the left. Now, again, if they believe these things, they should argue these things. They certainly have a right to do so. But on balance, I would encourage my fellow Christians to think through these things very carefully, to not throw out. Today, I run into far too many young conservative men who have just given up on what they call liberalism. They want to throw it out and embrace pretty statist solutions. And I would, try to counsel them and say, wait a minute, maybe we should listen to Burke. And before we throw out these institutions and policies and practices that have developed over centuries and centuries, we should be really thoughtful, very careful, and we should think about the results. If we get rid of freedom of speech, how's that going to work out for conservatives in many, many places, right? That might not work out so well at all. So I think working on our own side, so to speak, trying to, get people to think through some of the implications of what they're arguing, encourage them. Look, as followers of Christ, we have to treat others with respect and dignity. We should be treat others as we would want to be treated. As we reach out to people in the center, make arguments that have a chance of appealing to them, arguing as Stephen Wolfe does that we should basically go back to the 17th century reformers and embrace what they thought was right. That ain't going to appeal to anyone except for a quirky group of Calvinists. And I say this as someone who's pretty Calvinist in my own theology. And then with respect to the people on the far left, I have the hardest time with them. And sometimes I'm a little vicious when I engage them. And so I need to restrain myself, right? Even though I think someone like an Andrew Seidel is profoundly in error, I should still treat him with respect and dignity. For sure, I'm going to critique his arguments, but I should do so in a civil fashion.
Yeah. The thing that I think broke me was the whole David French
Mhm.
Amari debate over drag queens, that liberalism, our shared liberty, kind of that defensive posture, like if we crack down on this, they're gonna we're gonna erode our own protections. I just I can't go there. When something is so obviously morally wrong. Where do you fall on that? Are you arguing that we have to protect liberalism at all costs, so we have to carve out space for the drag queens to be around kids, or how do we think through that?
Yeah, so I don't think so. No. So I think, part of what French is probably thinking of, and I read the debate at the time. I don't remember the details, but at least my way of thinking about it, it was initially Christians who benefited from this sort of logic, right? So a Christian group wanted to meet on a college campus, and the college said, "Oh, we can't allow this because of the separation of church and state." And this case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, "Wait a minute. No, no, no. Not only does the Establishment Clause not prohibit it, the free exercise clause requires you not to discriminate on the basis of content. You have to grant Christians the same access as you grant everyone else, the libertarians, the young atheists, the Democrats. And so you can't, no, you could say no groups can meet on campus at all. But if you say we have a limited public forum, you have to include Christian groups. The recent case involving Boston, where Boston allowed different flags to be flown from a third flagpole. So you have the U.S. flag, the state flag, and they're flying every sort of other flag from private organizations in other countries. And Boston says, "Oh, no, no, Christians, you can't fly the Christian flag." The U.S. Supreme Court came back using the same sort of logic and say, "No, Boston, you don't have to let anyone fly flags. But if you're going to do this, you have to allow Christians to fly flags on the same terms as others." So at least one option for public libraries, say, would be to say, look, we're just going to focus on our core business of loaning out books and videos, and we aren't going to have any sort of story hours. Or I think here you could actually make an argument that, yeah, we're going to have story hours, but we're going to have certain stipulations that there can't be a political agenda. We have to come, people have to come in and just simply read books to children, or maybe the librarians will read the books to, so there's ways maybe you can get away with just simply figuring out how to keep people who want to have drag queen story hours out of the libraries. Part of the problem, of course, is I suspect where this oftentimes goes on, the library's all in, and the city government, a place like San Francisco, obviously, is all in, and most of the population is all in. And so you don't really, the library doesn't want to ban this. Whereas I think you probably don't hear many of these stories coming out of places like Alabama and in Florida, right? So there's ways of getting at these desired outcomes. But I think I have to agree with French in the final analysis, and he annoys me sometimes, I have to admit. But yeah, I think basically Christians and conservatives benefit a lot from the broadly liberal regime that says, look, we're going to have freedom of speech with limits, freedom of press, the free exercise of religion. And this means, I think it's fair to say, it means that we have to permit things that we think are inappropriate. We have to permit the practitioners of Santeria to engage in animal sacrifice, for instance. We think that's a false religion. We don't like them doing that. And yet religious liberty requires that the ability of everyone to act upon their religious convictions be respected wherever possible. Of course, we aren't going to let any group engage in human sacrifice. But in general, I do think we benefit more from this broadly liberal regime than if we were to get away from it. And I think people who don't like it assume if we got away from it, it would be people like you and me and Amari who are controlling things. And I just think that would be the case in very few instances, certainly not at the national level. And so prudence would dictate that we not go down that way, that direction.
Yeah, I understand that argument. I think it assumes though that the other side plays by those rules. and I'm not sure that we have that shared set of rules of the game anymore. Just with the complete dominance that the left and LGBT community has, with such a small percentage of the population, it just doesn't seem like that defensive posture is ultimately going to protect us, but happy to be proven wrong on that.
Well, let me agree with you. They do not play fair. They do not play in a principled fashion. I had lunch just yesterday with a friend of mine who is a representative, the attorney representing the cake bakers in Oregon, who ran afoul of the Bureau of Labor and Industry in our case. And you would think this would have been resolved after Masterpiece Cake Shop because there was a lot of anti-religious animus. The case was remanded, and the appellate court just simply said, "Oh, we were right all along. We don't have to change anything." And now you would think, in light of 303 Creative, that they would have to say, "Okay, fine, we were wrong," but apparently they aren't. On the other hand, you have these wonderful legal advocacy groups, First Liberty, ADF, and others, that are fighting the fight, and they keep coming back and pushing. And as I've already hinted, right, 303 Creative, the Boston Flag case, the Maine vouchers case, we're ultimately getting a lot. In some ways, the U.S. Supreme Court has never done a better job of protecting religious liberty or taking an appropriate understanding of what the Establishment Clause requires. And so the other side will fight and keep fighting, but that's why we have to push back. And I think in some instances, we try to negotiate and come up with solutions. In other cases, we have to go to court. And at least right now, we're receiving a lot of victories, and we should be grateful for those. I think sometimes one of the problems, perhaps, is even groups like ADF and Beckett and First Liberty, when they want to raise funds, they send out all sorts of emails and whatnot saying, religious liberty is under assault, give us money quickly. And it might create an impression that we're losing all the time, whereas actually the exact opposite is true. Religion is winning all the time. And by religion here, I don't just mean Christianity. Islamic prisoners are winning the right to grow facial hair, and Islamic employees wearing a right to wear a hijab, and appropriately so, I think.
What do you think of some of the stuff DeSantis is doing down in Florida? Would you say he's going too far with kind of banning a lot of the curriculum in schools, or do you think that's an appropriate use of government power?
I was actually pretty intimately involved with putting together the civics curriculum, the civic standards, the endorsement and whatnot. And I have to say it is excellent. It really requires what I think is an accurate and fair account of American history and politics. It basically says, look, teachers ought to know something about and should teach the Mayflower Compact, the Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and so forth and so on. And we have to recognize the horrible evils of slavery, for instance. So I can tell you at any point in that curriculum where racism or slavery should be discussed, it is discussed. And so I think he oftentimes gets a bad rap. He certainly got a bad rap with the African-American AP stuff, which I was not involved with, but, just totally distorted what it did and what it didn't do. In terms of some of the attempt to ban critical race theory, I think there are legitimate complaints that it's maybe overly broad. But those, I'm not an expert about that. I haven't looked at the actual, say, legislation. And so I'm not going to weigh in on that without having looked at it. I do think it's not as I recall, the inaccurately labeled Don't Say Gay bill said things like teachers K through third grade shouldn't be teaching anything about sex in the classroom. And I have to say that's eminently sensible, right? I no longer have children that young, but if I did, and I sent my first grader off to school, I want her to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic and about flowers. And I don't want a conservative Christian or anyone else teaching her about sex, right? That's not the job of the public schools or really any school, I would say, for that matter. And so I have to say, in general, I like DeSantis a lot. I like a lot of what he's done in Florida. Some of it might have been overreach or overly broad, but these things will be hammered out, and maybe he'll have to pull them back some. And if so, that's a democratic and legal process.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. Can you tell people where they can find you, where they can get your books?
Sure. So my wife built me a website, markdavidhall.org. And so you can go there and find a list of all my books, academic and otherwise. I teach at Regent University in our new PhD program in politics. And if anyone's interested in pursuing that sort of thing, they can just reach out to me directly. My contact information is on the Regent homepage.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mark. I think this is, it's clear we're maybe coming at some of this stuff from slightly different perspectives, but I think this is the type of conversation that Christians need to be engaging in more, respectful, just hearing each other out, and your wealth of knowledge on the founding. So I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to me, Josh. I really appreciate it.
That's our show for today. Big thanks to Mark David Hall for joining me for this conversation. I'll have links in the show notes where you can buy his books, especially the two latest were both excellent. I really recommend you check those out. Through the course of this conversation and putting this episode together, I realized I haven't talked a ton about Christian nationalism here on the podcast. And I know it's a hot topic of conversation, a lot of hot sports opinions about it. I've spent a lot more time talking about it on Twitter, but I realized not everyone that listens to the show follows me on Twitter. So I think I'm going to be doing an episode in the near future talking about Christian nationalism and how we should think about that as Christians. Is it a good idea? Is it a good label? Should we reject the label completely? I have a lot of thoughts on this, so I think I'll be putting that together real soon. If you found this conversation helpful, go ahead and share it with a friend. This is, I think, something that Christians need to be aware of, something that, I think a lot of us, particularly if we grew up maybe going to public school and hearing one version of the American founding that a lot of us are just not informed about. So I think this would be a great episode to share with folks. If you're listening on Apple Podcast, go ahead and leave a rating and review over there. That's very helpful. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you want to get in touch with me, I am my DMs are open on Twitter. That's the best place to reach me. I would be happy to connect. If you have any ideas for future episodes, please drop me a line there. But until next time, I will talk to you soon.